"Spread your legs and let me see," lonely cowboy ordered the giant bride on Christmas Eve, but his true purpose was to prove she was still pure despite the rumors. "Spread your legs and let me see." The words hung in the warm cabin air on Christmas Eve, 1884, as Tobias Brennan, a lonely cowboy who'd buried his wife 3 winters ago, knelt before the chair where his giant mail-order bride sat trembling in her simple cream dress. Delilah Hartwell, towering at 6'2" with broad shoulders and strong hands that had cradled orphans back east, stared down at this smaller man who'd ordered her across 1,000 miles of frozen prairie, her dark eyes filled with the kind of fear that comes from being rejected too many times. The Christmas tree glowed behind them with soft candlelight, its pine-scented branches decorated with red ribbons and hope, while outside the window snow fell on the Montana darkness, and the town of Bitterroot whispered their vicious rumors that this giant bride had entertained men in Philadelphia, that she was soiled goods, that no decent cowboy should marry such a woman. But this lonely cowboy wasn't examining her like livestock at auction, wasn't sneering at her unfeminine height or her imposing frame. His rough rancher's hands rested gently on her knee as he knelt on the hard cabin floor, his weathered face turned up toward hers with something that looked almost like reverence, his voice cracking when he'd spoken those shocking words. Delilah's hands gripped her dress fabric, pulling it slightly as she sat in that wooden chair by the glowing Christmas tree, her body rigid with the terrible certainty that this moment would end like all the others, with disgust, with rejection, with another door closing in her face. But the lonely cowboy's true purpose wasn't what she thought. He wasn't trying to confirm the rumors that had followed her from the train station. He was risking his entire reputation to prove she was still pure, to save her from the church council's public examination at dawn, to protect the woman whose 6 months of letters had made him fall in love with a soul he'd never seen. As his gentle hands remained on her leg on that frozen Christmas Eve, as the firelight danced across their faces and the town prepared to destroy them both at sunrise, one desperate question burned between them. Why would a lonely cowboy who barely reached her shoulder defend a giant bride the whole world had condemned? And the darker truth neither could speak aloud. What if his examination proved her innocence, but destroyed the fragile trust beginning to bloom between two broken souls who'd both been told they weren't worthy of love? The stagecoach had arrived just 2 hours earlier, rattling through the snow-covered streets of Bitterroot with its cargo of mail, supplies, and one very tall woman who made every head turn. Delilah had stepped down from that coach knowing exactly what would happen next because it always happened the same way. First came the stares, then the whispers. Then the man who'd sent for her would take one look at her imposing height, her unfashionably broad frame, and he'd suddenly remember an urgent errand in the next county. She'd watched it play out in 3 different towns before this one. 3 different men who'd written beautiful letters about wanting a strong woman, a capable woman, a woman who could handle frontier life. But when they saw what strong actually looked like on a woman's body, when they had to stand next to her and feel small, every single one had found a reason to send her back. So when Tobias Brennan pushed through the crowd at the station, when she looked down at this man who barely came up to her chin, she'd already started planning which train would take her back east. Already started composing the letter to the Philadelphia orphanage begging for her job back, even though there was no job to return to. Even though the scandal had made sure she'd never work with children again. But Tobias hadn't run. He'd looked up at her with eyes the color of creek water after rain, and he'd said 4 words that made her chest ache. "Hello, Delilah. Welcome home." Not, "You're taller than I expected," or "There must be some mistake," or any of the other phrases she'd learned to brace for. Just welcome home, like she belonged somewhere for the first time in her 29 years. He'd helped her into his wagon, his hands careful on her elbow despite the fact that she could probably lift him off the ground if she wanted to. He'd covered her lap with a thick wool blanket that smelled like horses and hay and something else, something like safety. And he'd driven her through town while every shopkeeper and housewife stared from their windows, while the livery owner called out something crude that made Tobias's jaw clench, while the whole world watched this mismatched pair and judged them before they'd even spoken more than pleasantries. The cabin sat 3 miles outside town, tucked against a stand of pine trees, with smoke curling from its chimney like a promise. Tobias had decorated for her arrival. That's what broke her heart first, not his words or his kind eyes, but the evergreen boughs draped over the doorway, the wreath hanging on the rough-hewn door, the way he'd clearly tried to make this bachelor's quarters feel like a home. When she'd stepped inside and seen the Christmas tree by the window, its branches strung with popcorn and ribbons, she'd had to turn away so he wouldn't see her tears. No one had decorated for her since her mother died 5 years ago. No one had cared enough to try. "I made supper," Tobias had said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Nothing fancy, just venison stew and biscuits, but you must be hungry after that long journey." She was hungry. Starving, actually, because she'd been too nervous to eat anything since leaving Philadelphia. But she couldn't make her voice work to tell him so. She just nodded and let him guide her to the table, this small man who moved around her like she was something precious instead of something oversized and unwanted. The stew was good, better than good. He'd added herbs that reminded her of her mother's cooking, and the biscuits were warm and flaky and tasted like someone had actually cared about making them right. They ate in silence for a few minutes. The only sound the crackling fire and the wind pushing snow against the windows. Then Tobias set down his spoon and looked at her with an expression that made her stomach drop. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And you're not going to like it." Here it comes, Delilah thought. The real reason he'd brought her all this way. The conditions she'd have to meet. The impossible standards she'd failed to reach. "The stagecoach driver recognized you," Tobias continued, his voice tight with anger. "He was in Philadelphia last year on business. He saw the wanted posters, the ones that man's family put up after you rejected their son." Delilah's hand froze halfway to her mouth. The biscuit crumbled between her fingers. "He told everyone in town that you're a fallen woman, that you entertained men for money back east, that any man who marries you is getting used goods." The cabin walls seemed to close in. Delilah couldn't breathe. She'd thought, foolishly, stupidly, that she could outrun those lies, that 1,000 miles would be enough distance. But shame traveled faster than any train. "I understand," she managed to whisper. "I'll leave on the morning stage. You don't have to." "The town council held an emergency meeting this afternoon," Tobias interrupted. "While I was driving you home, they passed a resolution." He pulled a crumpled paper from his pocket, smoothed it on the table between them. Delilah couldn't read the legal language, but she caught words like moral character and physical examination and annulment. Her vision blurred. "They want Doc Henderson to examine you tomorrow morning," Tobias said, and his voice was shaking now. "Before the wedding, in front of witnesses from the council, to verify that you haven't—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Delilah understood exactly what they wanted to do to her. Understood that these righteous men in their church suits wanted to spread her legs in some cold examination room and poke at her body like she was a mare being sold at auction. Wanted to verify her purity in front of an audience because a woman's word, especially a woman who'd been accused, meant nothing at all. "I won't do it," she said, and her voice came out stronger than she expected. "I won't let them humiliate me like that. I'd rather die alone than give them the satisfaction." Tobias's hand shot across the table, covering hers. His palm was warm and calloused and surprisingly gentle. "You won't have to," he said. Because we're getting married tonight, right now, and I'll be the one to examine you." Delilah jerked her hand back like she'd been burned. "What? If you're already my wife when they come tomorrow, the law protects you. They can't force a married woman to undergo examination against her husband's wishes. But they'll ask me if I verified your virtue before the wedding." His eyes locked onto hers. "I need to be able to look them in the eye and tell them the truth, that you came to me pure, that all their rumors are lies, that they can take their council resolution and burn it for kindling." The room spun. Delilah gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling. "You want to examine me, yourself? I want to protect you from something far worse." Tobias stood, moved around the table but kept his distance. "Doc Henderson has hands like ice and a heart to match. He'll make it hurt, Delilah. Not because he has to, but because he can. Because men like him enjoy making women feel small." He swallowed hard. "I won't enjoy it. I'll hate every second of knowing I'm part of this. But I'll be gentle. I'll be quick. And I'll do it here, in private, with only the Christmas tree and God as witnesses instead of a room full of men who want to see you broken." Delilah stared at this man she'd known for less than 3 hours. This lonely cowboy who decorated his cabin with pine boughs and baked biscuits and was now offering to do something awful in order to spare her from something worse. Part of her wanted to run. Wanted to grab her carpet bag and walk out into the snow and keep walking until the cold took her or she reached somewhere, anywhere, that people didn't care about purity and reputation and whether a woman's body met their standards. But another part of her, the part that had survived false accusations and family rejection and 3 failed attempts at starting over, that part whispered that maybe this man was different. Maybe his hands would be as gentle as his eyes suggested. Maybe his true purpose really was protection, not possession. "Why?" she asked, and her voice cracked. "You don't even know me. Why would you risk your reputation defending mine?" Tobias was quiet for a long moment. Outside, church bells began to ring for Christmas Eve service, their distant chiming a reminder that somewhere in town, families were gathering for hymns and hot cider and the kind of belonging Delilah had forgotten existed. "Because your letters saved my life," he finally said. 3 years ago, my wife Sarah died in childbirth, the baby too, and I spent the next 2 years wishing I'd died with them." He moved to the window, stared out at the falling snow. "Then your first letter arrived. You wrote about the little girl at the orphanage who wouldn't speak, about how you sang her to sleep every night until she found her voice again. And I thought if someone that kind exists in this world, maybe it's worth staying in it." He turned back to her, and his eyes were wet. "So yes, I'd risk my reputation. I'd risk everything. Because you already saved me once. And you didn't even know you were doing it." The Christmas tree lights blurred through Delilah's tears. 6 months of letters had felt like a lifeline when she was drowning in scandal and shame. She'd poured her heart into those pages, never expecting that someone was reading them and finding reasons to keep living. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "Every man I've ever known has found a reason to reject me. My height, my strength, my refusal to pretend I'm something I'm not. What if you examine me and find some flaw, some imperfection, some reason to change your mind?" Tobias crossed the room, stopped just close enough that she could smell wood smoke and leather and honest sweat. "Then I'll love you anyway," he said simply. "Because I'm not looking for perfection, Delilah. I'm looking for real." He held out his hand, small and scarred and steady. "So I'm asking, will you let me prove to the world that you're exactly what you say you are? Will you trust me enough to be vulnerable, just this once, so I can protect you from men who'll make you vulnerable every day for the rest of your life, if we don't stop them now?" Delilah looked at his outstretched hand, then at the Christmas tree glowing softly in the corner, then at the door, that led back to the snow and the stagecoach and the endless running. She thought about the orphans she'd left behind, about the little girl named Maggie who'd learned to speak again because someone had been patient and gentle and refused to give up. She thought about her mother braiding her hair even when she grew too tall to sit comfortably on her lap, whispering that being different wasn't the same as being wrong. And she thought about this lonely cowboy who'd lost everything and somehow still had enough heart left to fight for a woman he'd only just met. Delilah took his hand. It was smaller than hers, rougher, warmer than she expected. "Yes," she whispered, and the word felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness, hoping someone would catch her before she hit the ground. Tobias exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for hours. "Thank you," he said, and his voice broke on the words. "I promise I'll make this as bearable as I can." He guided her toward the Christmas tree, and Delilah realized he'd thought about this, had planned it out to make the moment less clinical, less cold. The candles on the tree cast soft shadows across the room. The fire crackled warm. Outside the window, snow continued to fall like the whole world was holding its breath. "Tell me about the orphanage," Tobias said, as his hands moved to the top button of her dress. Delilah's breath caught. "What?" "Tell me about Maggie, the little girl who wouldn't talk." His fingers were steady on the second button, but his eyes never left her face. "I need you to remember who you are while I do this. Not a body being examined, a woman with stories that matter." Her hands trembled as she gripped the chair arms. She was 5 years old, found on the streets with no memory of her family. The other caretakers thought she was simple-minded, but I knew better. Button 3. Button 4. His movements were slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to stop him. "How did you know?" "Because she watched everything. Her eyes followed conversations even when she didn't speak. She understood. She just didn't trust the world enough to put words into it." Tobias pushed the dress off her shoulders, and Delilah's chest tightened with shame and fear and something else she couldn't name. But he was still looking at her face, still listening like her story mattered more than her body. "What did you do?" "I sang to her, every night for 2 months, the hymns my mother taught me." The dress pooled at her feet, leaving her in just her thin chemise. Delilah wanted to cover herself, wanted to disappear, but Tobias's steady gaze kept her anchored. "And one morning, I woke up to find her standing by my bed, humming the melody. She started talking that same day. You gave her back her voice." Tobias knelt before her chair, his position somehow reverent rather than dominant. "That's who you are, Delilah. That's what I see when I look at you." His hands rested on her knees, outside her chemise, warm and grounding. "Not a woman who needs to prove anything. A woman who's already proven everything that matters." The Christmas tree lights flickered. Somewhere distant, the church bells rang again. And Delilah realized that for the first time in her life, a man was kneeling before her, not to diminish her, but to lift her up. "I'm going to examine you now," Tobias said gently. "Tell me if you need me to stop. Any moment, any reason. Your word is enough." She nodded, unable to speak past the tears choking her throat. And as his hands moved with careful reverence, as he spoke softly through every moment, Delilah understood that this lonely cowboy was giving her something she'd never had before. Not just protection, not just belief, but the kind of gentleness that proved love could exist even in the hardest moments. Even when the world demanded proof instead of faith. His hands trembled as he lifted the hem of her chemise, and Delilah saw tears streaming down his weathered face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "God forgive me. I'm so sorry you have to endure this." But his touch was feather-light, clinical yet somehow tender, and he kept talking to keep her grounded in the moment. "There's a scar on your shin. How'd you get it?" His voice was steady, even though his hands shook. Climbing a tree, she managed. I was 12. There was a kitten stuck in the branches, crying for its mother. Of course there was. A broken laugh escaped him. Of course you risked yourself to save something helpless. His examination was swift, thorough, and so careful she almost couldn't believe this was the same thing the council had planned to do to her in front of witnesses. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed but blazing with something fierce. You're untouched, completely pure. Every vicious lie they told about you, every single word, it's all poison. He lowered her chemise with shaking hands, helped her back into her dress with the same gentle care he'd used removing it. And now I can stand before them tomorrow and testify to the truth. Delilah's whole body was shaking. Relief and humiliation and gratitude crashed through her in waves that left her breathless. "Thank you," she whispered, "for making it bearable. Don't thank me for being decent." Tobias stood, wiped his eyes roughly with his sleeve. "Thank me after we're married and safe from their cruelty." He grabbed his coat from the peg. "Pastor Williams agreed to marry us tonight. Midnight ceremony, just us and him and God. By morning, you'll be Mrs. Brennan, and the law will protect what those men can't touch." But as they prepared to leave for the church, as Tobias helped her into her cloak and hitched the horses to the sleigh, Delilah saw something that made her blood run cold. Riders approaching through the snow, 5 of them, carrying torches that cut through the darkness like accusations. "Stay inside," Tobias ordered, but his voice had gone hard as iron. "Whatever happens, stay inside and lock the door." The riders pulled up in front of the cabin, and Delilah recognized the man in front, Mayor Caldwell, owner of the bank and half the businesses in town. His brother-in-law, Judge Morrison, sat beside him, along with Doc Henderson and 2 other council members. "Evening, Brennan," the mayor called out, his voice thick with false courtesy. "Heard you collected quite a package from the stage today." Tobias stepped off the porch, placing himself between the mounted men and his cabin. "My fiancée arrived safely, if that's what you're asking." "Fiancée." The judge spat the word like it tasted rotten. "That's a mighty generous term for a woman with her reputation." Through the window, Delilah watched Tobias's spine straighten. "Miss Hartwell's reputation is spotless. Any rumors you've heard are lies spread by a family back east who couldn't handle her rejecting their son's advances." "Interesting theory," Doc Henderson drawled. "But the council voted. Any woman of questionable virtue must be examined before marriage. We're here to collect her." "Like hell you are." The mayor's horse shifted nervously as tension crackled through the frozen air. "You're defying a legal resolution, Brennan. That's a serious matter." Tobias didn't flinch. "What's serious is 5 men riding out on Christmas Eve to terrorize a woman who's done nothing wrong except be tall and survive false accusations." His voice dropped to something dangerous. "You want to examine her? You'll have to go through me first." Judge Morrison leaned forward in his saddle, his face twisted with contempt. "We can have the sheriff arrest you for obstruction, then we'll examine her anyway, and you'll watch from a jail cell." "Try it." Tobias's hand moved to his hip, not quite touching his gun, but making his meaning clear. "See how that plays with the decent folks in this town when they hear you arrested a man for protecting his bride on Christmas Eve." The standoff stretched taut as wire. Delilah's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst. This lonely cowboy, this man who barely reached her shoulder, was standing against 5 powerful men who could destroy his life with a word. Standing there because he'd promised to protect her. Because 6 months of letters had taught him that her soul was worth defending even if the world condemned her body. Then a new voice cut through the darkness. "What in God's name is happening here?" Pastor Williams emerged from the snow on his mare, his white collar visible even in the torchlight. Behind him rode 3 more figures, Mrs. Chen from the general store, old Samuel the blacksmith, and surprisingly, the sheriff himself. "These men are enforcing a council resolution," Mayor Caldwell said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "A resolution passed in secret this afternoon," Pastor Williams said coldly, "without proper notice or public comment. I checked with the county clerk. It's not legally binding." The mayor's face darkened. "The moral character of our town is measured by how we treat the most vulnerable among us," the pastor interrupted. "Not by how viciously we tear down a woman based on rumors." He turned to Tobias. "I came to tell you the ceremony is ready, though it seems we have uninvited guests." Sheriff Pike cleared his throat. "Mayor Caldwell, Judge Morrison, I suggest you gentlemen head home. You're trespassing on private property, and I don't recall seeing any warrant." For a long moment, Delilah thought the mayor would push it further. But Mrs. Chen spoke up, her voice sharp as winter wind. "My husband and I rode here to witness this wedding. So did Samuel. So did half a dozen other folks waiting at the church. Word spread about what you plan to do to this woman, and decent people don't stand for it." The mayor looked around, seeing his power crumble in the face of unexpected resistance. "This isn't over, Brennan," he finally spat. "We'll see about this marriage." "Yes, you will," Tobias said evenly. "You'll see it every Sunday when my wife and I sit in church. You'll see it every time we come to town. And you'll have to live with knowing you tried to destroy an innocent woman and failed." The riders turned and disappeared into the snow, their torches fading like dying stars. Delilah burst from the cabin, running to Tobias, and when she reached him, she didn't care that she towered over him or that people were watching. She wrapped her arms around this brave, gentle man who'd risked everything for her. "You stood up to them," she whispered against his shoulder. "You actually stood up to them. I told you I would." His arms came around her waist, steady and sure. "I told you after tonight, anyone who questions you questions me." They married at midnight in a small church filled with people Delilah had never met, people who'd heard about the council's cruelty and decided to stand witness to something better. When Tobias slipped a simple gold band on her finger and kissed her for the first time, she tasted salt from both their tears. And when they returned to the cabin as husband and wife, as the Christmas dawn broke pink and gold over the Montana mountains, Delilah Brennan realized she'd finally found what she'd been searching for all along. Not a place where her size didn't matter, but a person who saw past her body to the heart underneath, who valued her gentleness as much as her strength, who proved that real love wasn't about meeting standards. It was about standing together when the whole world demanded you stand apart. Tobias pulled her close by the Christmas tree, this giant bride and her lonely cowboy, two misfits who'd found each other across 1,000 miles of faith and letters and desperate hope. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Brennan," he whispered. "Merry Christmas," she whispered back. And for the first time in her life, Delilah believed that she was finally, truly, home. So here's a question for you watching. Have you ever been judged for something beyond your control, for being too much or not enough of what the world expected? And men, would you have the courage to stand up for someone when it cost you everything? Women, would you trust someone enough to be vulnerable after the world taught you that vulnerability only brings pain? Drop your answers in the comments below and tell us where you're watching from. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories about real love, real courage, and real second chances. Because sometimes the most powerful love stories are the ones where two broken people prove that together, they're strong enough to face anything.